Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back, everybody. Good to see everybody here. Let's hear it. Come on, man. I would like to thank all of you for coming tonight, especially those of you who traveled a fair distance. Chick, for coming from Banff, thank you very much. John McIsaac and Lynn Martell, thanks for coming up from Canmore. Who else had a bit of a road trip? Well, Laurie Skresla did. He doesn't even live in a town anymore. I don't know where he lives, somewhere out southwest of Calgary. Thanks for coming to the show. I know it was tempting tonight. There's another competing event. The Men Without Hats concert was going. So thanks for coming here. You don't remember Men Without Hats? Oh, cool. So anyway, don't think about that. We're here. Anyway, thanks for coming, guys. This promises to be an amazing show. CMC slideshow to remember. Mike Sawyer, welcome. You guys all know Mike's name. It's incredible to think he's never done a Calgary Mountain Club slideshow ever. This is his first show with the CMC. And I am now going to welcome honorary CMC member Laurie Skresla to give the proper introduction. Welcome, Laurie.
So, okay, so Andrew and I had a hard time getting information on Mike. We searched the web, and there's not much on the web about Mike Sawyer. So Andrew used some of his, what's that? That's what we did. So Andrew got some of his students at the high school he teaches at to research through the dark web, and we were able to dig up some interesting information. So I'm going to address Mike, if you can hear me, Mike, if I can get this on. There are many people much more qualified than me to introduce you, Mike, but no one else returned Andrew's phone calls. So here I am. I've known Mike for over 55 years, and I've seen him evolve successfully in every endeavor he chooses to focus on. And his focus that I've noticed is somewhat frightening. He told me once there was no horror he had not witnessed, no degradation he would not suffer, nor no fierce or deadly deed he would not commit to achieve his goals. And I've seen him cold-bloodedly pursue those things that he's interested in. These are sides of Mike that you don't really know about until either you date him or you know him as a friend. Now, I saw this clearly when, in a moment of weakness on Helmet Falls with Mike and Mike, mine just went, yeah, John McIsaac, we were on Helmet Falls skiing in to try to get a first ascent of it. In a moment of weakness, I admitted to Mike that I was frightened. The waterfall intimidated me. His response to me was to whisper in my ear, "You spineless excuse for a human being. You're going to get up this or I'll smash your face in with my ice tool." So needless to say, his motivation worked for me. And although we didn't get up on that attempt, eventually, I think it was the next winter, we were able to climb it. There are so many ways to describe Mike Sawyer. Accomplished mountaineer, writer, musician, recluse, hermit, needy, vindictive, overrated. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And I'm often asked, who do you think was the greatest climber of the late 70s? And I always answer, it was you, Mike. So, but we're here tonight to not to dwell on Mike's attributes, but to give Mike an opportunity to describe how he became one of the biggest drug dealers in the Western Hemisphere. Please join me in extending to Mike a warm Calgary Mountain Club. And he also admitted to us that to get him to be more verbal and smooth, he needs a good scotch to loosen his lips. And so we're going to present him with a glass of scotch when he gets up here on the stage. Mike will be signing his first best-selling book, How to Get Off Your Ass and Do Something with Your Life, later at the Mountain Club little enclave at the front. And he's got a few copies of his new book, which is entitled, What Do Women Really Want Anyway? So please join me in greeting Mike Sawyer.
With introductions like that, I was wondering, is this a slideshow or a roast? Now, does anyone else want to get in a jab or two before I start? No? Okay. Thank you very much. You know, when I was asked to do this, and it's true, I haven't ever given a slideshow at the Mountain Club. And I thought, I haven't climbed for 45 years. I mean, it's actually been 45 years last October when I had my wreck in Robson and lost my hand. And I thought, what do I have to say to a group of climbers? And Andrew Brash said, "Oh, just tell a story." And so I decided that's what I have to do. But first of all, I want to say that this idea that one part of me goes, I'm honored to be asked to give this show, and then I think they're trying to squeeze it in before I get too old and I die, because there's no other way to look at it. So my show is you'll see the Great Hostel Shop Robbery and Other Lies, and my very short career as a drug dealer. Contrary to what Laurie said, I wasn't the biggest drug dealer in Western Canada, but I just want to clarify one thing historically. When I talk about the hostel shop robbery, I'm not talking about the hostel shop that Mike Mortimer owned. I'm talking about the hostel shop that existed before that, and that was an old house, and there was a house beside it that was the warehouse. Is there anyone in this room who actually remembers the old hostel shop? Okay, so we know what we're talking about. I'm going to get started. Oh, there we go. So I just want to start right before we go. This is not a slideshow about climbing, and I know that's going to be a great disappointment for some of you, and I'll just give you a moment. If you want to leave now, you can. But it's not about climbing. Oh. But it may be a slideshow about drinking. And as we know, the Calgary Mountain Club, I'm having some technical challenges here. After all, the Calgary Mountain Club has long been known as a drinking club with a climbing problem. And so what I'm going to do, I have a series of stories I want to tell, but I want to sort of provide some context of that. And when I could talk about my good friend Laurie Scresley and some of the climbs that we've done together, but I'm not going to do that. I just want to show this slide. This is a picture of Laurie and my son Ryan, who's sitting over here at an international arms dealer trade show down in Florida a few years ago. But I'm not going to talk about Laurie. And as a member of the Junior Boys Choir, I could actually talk to you about the Junior Boys Choir and some of its exploits in the 70s and early 80s. And for those who don't know, the Junior Boys Choir were Rob Matt, Gary Jennings, myself, Daryl Jones, Jim Elzinga in the back row, and Bruce Keller and John Lauchlan in the front row with their respective girlfriends or wives. But I'm not going to talk about the Junior Boys Choir. So I could talk about the time I spent in the valley and some of the routes I did. And, it's not a climbing show, so I have to be very careful here. I did climb the nose and a couple other routes in El Cap. And I don't want to talk about the climbing per se, but what I do want to tell you is Dan Griffiths and I did the nose. And what was interesting about that is that the day before we went on the climb, we went up, picked the first couple pitches with the idea that we would just get a jump on it. And when we came back up the next morning to start the route, 3 hapless climbers that were rappelling off the nose fell from 3,000 or 2,000 feet up and hit the ground about 50 yards to the side of us. And it kind of put us off. It didn't do them any good, but it really put us off. And so that climbing the nose with the specter of this horrible accident that occurred right beside us was actually quite a challenge. I won't get into all the details because this isn't a story about climbing. The next thing I want to tell you about is North Face at the Half Dome. And again, I'm not going to tell you about the climb, but what the interesting thing that happened here was that when JP Cadeau and I got to the top of the climb, it was just coming on dark. And I don't know if anyone's been there, but it's about a 10-mile walk out to the trailhead. So we decided, beautiful California night, the stars were out, it's warm. We thought, well, let's just sleep on the summit, and then next morning we'll walk out. We got up on top and laid out our sleeping bags, and we're enjoying the evening, drifted off to sleep. And I don't know how many of you have been up Half Dome, but there's a tourist trail that comes out the back, and there's a long metal ladder that comes up so that the tourists can walk up the slabs to get to the summit. And so about 3 o'clock in the morning, we're sound asleep and we hear this noise. And it was sort of clank, 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 clank. And we woke up and we both looked at each other and said, "What's that?" And they said, "Sounds like someone's coming up the ladder." 3 o'clock in the morning. Clank, 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 clank. It gets louder, closer it gets. And then finally this character pops over the top. And he was wearing a three-piece brown business suit, street shoes, like business street shoes, and carrying a brown briefcase. And we're just going like, well, this is really weird. So we introduced each other and we told him we just climbed up the face, and he says, "Yeah, I'm out for a walk." And he sits down and he says, "You guys want to smoke some opium?" And he pops open his briefcase and he has this like really large brick of opium in his, and it was California, mid-70s. We didn't want to sound like we were totally, straight. So we said, "Yeah, why not?" And so he peeled off a bowl of this opium, and on the summit of Half Dome, we smoked this bowl of opium, and we didn't say anything for about 2 hours. Like we just looked at the stars and a few shooting stars going by. And then at some point, he just jumped up. He said, "I got to go." Closed his briefcase and off he went, clank, 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 clank down. And we turned to each other and we just went like, "Whoa, that's a really weird experience." So no climbing, but an interaction with apparently a more successful drug dealer than I was going to become. So I could also tell a story about these two characters. If anyone, this is Alan Adrian Burgess, commonly known as the Burglar Twins. And again, we don't want to talk about climbing, but I did a few climbs with them. And one of the things that we did, which was quite entertaining, was we tried to do the first winter ascent of the Becky Chenard. And we went into the Becky Chenard. The weather was perfect. It was dry. There was very little snow on the face. And we ended up getting up to this ledge right here in our first day. Climbing was great. It was almost dry. And then we got hit by the most vicious storm that you could imagine. And, I've learned over my life that if you're in a dodgy situation and you're with other people who are more experienced than you are, and the Burgess twins are way more experienced than I ever would be, I thought, well, and we're on this ledge in the middle of the night. It was probably 100-mile-an-hour winds. It was snowing like crazy. And I thought, I'm not worried because the two experienced guys don't look like they're worried. And then about, 4 o'clock in the morning, a raging storm. The wind was bending our tent right down onto our faces, and a rip appeared in one side of the tent. And suddenly they changed from being very relaxed to looking terrified. And they said, "Yeah, it's time to get our boots on." And so we all got dressed and sat in the tent, holding the tent in this wind until the sun came up. And then we realized our chance was gone and we repelled off. So the Burglar Twins. I could talk about the first ascent of Paper Chase with Carl Ostrom and I. And again, though, I don't want to talk about it because this is not supposed to be a climbing slideshow. Or I could talk about the trip to Robson where I lost my hand, where Doug Ward was going to ski down the North Face, which you see here. But again, that's probably for another slideshow because there's quite a lot of backstory on that, and I don't want to occupy everyone's time. More recently, I've been involved in a lot of environmental activism, and just last fall, I was one of the leaders in a group that set up a blockade on a logging road in Kananaskis in the Upper Highwood that prevented West Fraser from logging an area that is quite ecologically important. And it's ecologically important because the entire watershed has been designated as critical habitat for bull trout, which are theoretically protected under the Species at Risk Act. And we spent 2 months up there. We set up a camp right up at the top end of near the Highwood Pass, and that was a success. So much of my life since getting out of climbing has been focused on environmental work, sometimes professionally, sometimes as an activist. Now, my apologies for the old grainy historical photographs, but on the right is Steve Sutton, and with his back to us is Hugh Burton, two climbers that came from Squamish, but did spend quite a bit of time in Calgary. And is there anyone here that knew Steve or Hugh? Yeah, a few of us. So again, this is not a climbing story, but it's a story about Steve Sutton. And years ago, and I was lamenting with John and a few others that, in the early days of the mountain club, we really knew how to party. Like, we had absolutely stunning parties. At least that's my recollection. And I was at a party, mountain club party, and I believe it was at Trevor Jones's condo in South Calgary somewhere. And Steve was there, and a whole bunch of other people were there, and we were all drinking and having a good time. And Steve obviously had a keen insight into my character, and he knew that I was full of piss and vinegar. And so he said, Mike, he said, I want to challenge you to a drinking contest. Of course, being young and stupid, I said, oh, okay, let's go. And so out came the two 20-ounce A&W Frosty mugs, the big ones. And someone filled them up right to the lip with rye whiskey. And crowd gathered around because they knew this was going to be very entertaining. And 1, 2, 3, go. And I went, duh, 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 duh. And I got about a third of the way through this massive glass. And my body just, all the alarm bells were going, saying, like, stop, you idiot, stop. And so I stopped and I opened my eyes. And Sutton was standing there, hadn't touched a drop, with this big grin on his face, thinking, Mike, you dumbass, I just got you. And I absolutely got so shit-faced. It was, for me, it was almost inconceivable how drunk I was. In fact, I had poisoned myself. I staggered around. I fell out outside, and the night went on. And it was probably sometime in the middle of the night while I was sort of having the whirlies and falling over out in the yard. I pulled myself up on a vehicle in the parking lot. And as I pulled myself up in the vehicle, I vomited, just like, ugh, get all this poison in my system. And then I fell over and crawled under a spruce tree and slept it off. And you're probably all wondering, like, what's this got to do with Steve Sutton? What's got to Steve Sutton was it was his vehicle. And he had a brand new Toyota Tacoma pickup truck that he'd only probably had for 2 months. And I had accidentally and unintentionally thrown up on the hood of his car. And fell under the street, sleep. The sun came up. It was a hot summer day. No one really moved until about 10 o'clock because everyone had been up late the night before. And I'm laying under the spruce tree, and I hear this scream. And I open my eyes and I look over, and here's Sutton waving his hands and screaming in front of his truck. And so I went over there, and it turned out that, this is the vehicle that I had thrown up on. And the sun had sort of baked it into a bit of a crust. Okay. Now, I should have asked, is anyone having a meal while I'm telling this story? You're good. Okay. So we immediately got a garden hose out and went to spray off the evidence of my drunkenness. And the acid in the vomit had actually eaten through the paint. And so when we sprayed it off, it stripped it right down to the metal. And I've got a patent pending on that, but anyway, I felt really bad about it. I said to Steve, I said, look, Steve, I really feel bad about this. I said, go to a body shop and get a quote and get it fixed, and I'm good for it. I'll pay for you. And Steve said, okay. Now, Steve and I didn't see each other that often. Every other month we'd cross paths. And I saw him a couple months later, and I said, Steve, I said, where are we at with this repairing this damage I did to your car? I really want to get it sorted out. He goes, okay, I'll do it. I'll do it. And then nothing, didn't hear anything back. A couple months later, I saw him. I said, look, Steve, I really want to get this sorted. I'm feeling really bad about ruining your car. He looked at me, he said, Mike, he said, don't worry about it. He said, every time I look at that hood, I laugh so hard. He drove that car for 20 years. And every time he looked at it, he laughed at what a stupid ass I was. So we're going to talk about Vancouver. Again, I don't want to delve into the climbing part of it, but I kind of have to set the context for the story. And 77 was a big year in Calgary in the Mountain Club because we had a group of us that were going to Mount Vancouver. There was the all women's team led by Judy, who's here, went to Mount Logan, and Chick Scott, who's also here, led another trip to the southwest face of Logan. So it was a big effort from the Calgary crew. And I'm showing you this picture because I want you to take note of the van. And the van becomes part of the story here a little later on. What we did is we rented a van in Calgary, and a bunch of us loaded all of our equipment in there that we could, and we drove up to Whitehorse. And this is myself here and a few of the all ladies team getting ready to head up to Whitehorse. So long drive up to Whitehorse. We get up there, and we've been cooped up in this van for 2 days, and we took advantage of some time to stretch our legs, and we did a little bouldering on the side of the Whitehorse Inn. And this is a picture of a much younger Kathy Calvert bouldering on the side of the Whitehorse Inn. Now, as you probably all know, Kathy passed away 3 weeks ago, and so I was really sad to hear that, because I really got to know her on this trip, but then I also got to know her when I lived in Field, and her and Dale were essentially neighbors, and I was in contact every day. So I was really sad to hear that she'd passed away. And I wanted to say, first of all, my condolences to her family and Sylvia particularly. And I also want to say that they've said that there's going to be a celebration of life sometime later in the spring. And I'm just hoping, sorry? Oh, it's already been scheduled. Okay. So Judy tells me it's the 24th of April. So if anyone knew Kathy, who was a spectacular person, did she ever give a slideshow here? Oh, you missed out the chance then. It's too late. Anyway, from Whitehorse, we then drove out to Quaney Lake at the Arctic Institute Research Center airstrip, and disengorged all of our. Oh, I hit the wrong button here. Disengorged all of our gear, and I think it took us 4 or 5 or 6 days before we had good enough weather to fly into the mountains. So we spent a long time organizing and going through stuff, and we took the time to do some repairs. So here's a picture of me and John Lauchlan working on fixing up gear. I just want to notice that I do have a left hand in this photograph. Someone said that I should have called this by hook or by crook slideshow, but I thought it was kind of tasteless. So now, even though we had a lot of work going on getting ready, we did have an opportunity for some fun, and we had the crew down by the edge of the river, or edge of the lake on a hot tub. But and that actually might be one of the most famous mountain club photographs. But this is the route that we were going to go on Mount Vancouver, and I want to show you this because the plan was. Oh, I got a pointer here. The plan was to climb up some of these gullies to this ridge, up the ridge, and then over the top. And this is important because if we look at those gullies, our plan was to take these extremely long spools of polypropylene rope and fix the first couple thousand feet up these gullies, then come back down, get all our gear ready for push, and use those ropes to get up the gullies quickly. Well, the day after we fixed the ropes, we were down in base camp, which is probably 2.5 kilometers away from the Bergschrund. And I looked up and I said, the ropes are gone. And the other 3 guys on the team all looked up and said, no, they're not. You can't see those ropes from here. I said, yeah, I used to have pretty good eyes. And I said, no, they're gone. And John Lauchlan said, well, I'll bet you a beer they're not gone. And I said, well, you're on. And went up there the next day, and the ropes were all down on the bottom they'd been swept out of there by an avalanche. And so that started a trend over the entire climb. Every time there was a disagreement about even super trivial things, John would say, well, double or nothing. Double or nothing. And unfortunately, I won every time. And by the time we got to the end of the expedition, he said, I think we were up to 120 drinks. And he just said, never mind. I'll just buy all your drinks when we get out of here into the bar. So the talk about the climb is so we can set the context about who was paying for my drinks when I got out to the bar. Anyway, we climb the face. When we get up high, you can look across, and this is Mount Logan in the distance. And Chick's group was somewhere in here trying to climb up one of these faces. And the all women's team was on the other side of the mountain coming up the trench route. But we were all together. And fortunately, we got up to the top. John Calvert, Trevor Jones, and myself in the back with John Lauchlan in the front. But fortunately, all three expeditions came out to, flew out more or less within a day or two of each other. And we decided that we were going to go to celebrate our successes and survival, that we would all go down to Haines Junction to the bar. And so we had this 14-passenger van that I showed you earlier on, and we all piled into this van. We drove down to the bar. And, you know, I forgot to mention one thing, is that Chick's expedition had been sponsored. Was it Seagram's Chick? Right. So at the beginning of this, while we were hanging out at Haines Junction, I think we had like 7 or 8 cases of hard liquor. And Chick was very generous with sharing his cash with everyone that was there. So the idea of going down to the bar to celebrate was not, you know, it wasn't that new an idea. So we drive down there. We had a great night in the bar. And because I was drinking free drinks on John Lauchlan's tab, and for some strange reason in those days, I was really liking Black Russians, which were, you know, an ounce of vodka and an ounce of Tia Maria. And I drank a lot of Black Russians that night. And the other thing I remember about that night is that Sharon Wood and I got on the pool table, and we ruled the pool table for the whole night. Even as we got like absolutely shit-faced, we couldn't even see the balls. We were still beating everyone else. But the funny thing about that time in the bar is that in the bar, in the women's washroom, in one of the latrines, there was a pinup of a Playgirl poster, and over that Playgirl poster, there was a flap over the genitals on the picture. And what the thing was, when someone lifted up the flap, a siren and a light would start flashing in the bar. Now, we didn't know this, but I remember at one point this light came on and it stayed on. It was like, and I said to the bartender, I said, "What's the story with that light?" And they told me about this picture in the flap, and they said, "Well, someone's got to be in there holding the flap up." Well, 10 minutes later, a very, you know, coy and satisfied-looking Kathy Kelford comes out of the washroom. And of course, she didn't know. The whole bar just erupted in laughter. And anyway, again, these aren't climbing stories. This is some of the backstory. But the real story out of this was that at the end of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning, we all pile into the van, and we're not going back to Kewanee Lake because it's too far. We're just driving down the highway a few kilometers to a campground, and we were absolutely jammed in there, so jammed that I was the last person in the van, and the van had one of those. It was one of those vans that had the doors that open like this, and I was crammed in there like just like this in the door. We're driving down the highway. Chick was driving, and you know, this was like 50 years ago, so we wouldn't do that today because it's no longer appropriate. But and the Alaska Highway wasn't paved then; it was gravel. We're driving towards the campground, and Ron Langevin, one of the guys that was on Chick's expedition, was sitting beside me, and at one point there, without any warning, he said, "I gotta take a leak," and he reached over and he popped the door. Well, I'm compressed in there. The door opens up, and off I go, bouncing along the highway. And so I'm laying on the highway, and I swear to God, I had some cuts and abrasions, and my clothes were torn, but I wasn't really hurt. And I swear it was because I was totally relaxed. I was so drunk and so relaxed in my little hole, and I didn't even know what was happening. So when I hit the ground, I was completely relaxed. But I was, you know, laying there, and I thought, so I sit up wondering like what's going on, and the van's pulled to a stop, you know, 80 yards down the road, and I look and it's backing towards me, but it's kind of weaving like this, and before I could jump out of the way, the van stops, but it stopped, and one of the doors flung open and whacked me and knocked me into the ditch. Now, if you remember, the title slide here was "And Other Lies," and so I'm telling you what I think is the truth, but there are people in this crowd who could stand up and say, that's a lie. And so I just want to make sure that if I say anything that comes across as a lie, feel free to get up and express yourself. Anyway, I'm laying in the ditch. Well, Chick, we can talk about this later, but do you deny that you were driving the van? Okay, moving on. So I'm laying in the ditch, and now I'm starting to think, well, maybe I am hurt. You know, I'm bleeding and cutting. And the van pulls up, and I look up, and there's like 7 or 8 drunken faces pressed against the window of the van, looking down into the ditch. And I hear someone say, "Fuck it, he's done," and they drove away. Anyway, they probably didn't even know I wasn't in the van because everyone was so hammered that who knew. I lay there for a couple hours, and it was kind of like trying to figure out what was broken and what wasn't broken. And as it turned out, nothing was broken. And what inspired me to get up was that when the sun started coming up, the mosquitoes came out. And so I'm laying there and getting swarmed by mosquitoes. I thought, yeah, this is crazy. So I got up. We were only a couple kilometers from where the campground was. So I started walking down the highway towards the campground. And when I got to the campground, it was one of those campgrounds where to get to the campground by vehicle, you had to go about 500 yards past the campground and then cut onto the road and come back. And I thought, oh, screw it. I don't want to walk that. So I just went down through the bush, waded across the stream. And it was really quite interesting because there were 2 older gentlemen who were tourists who were out limbering up their fly rods for morning fishing in the stream. And there's this crazed, bloody, tattered guy comes crashing out of the bush and through the stream and up past them. I still remember the look on their face. It was just quite interesting. But the last part of the story is I thought, go to the van, get my sleeping bag because I need some sleep. Well, my sleeping bag's gone. And I thought, I knew I had my sleeping bag. And I looked over under a tree a few feet away from and I see my sleeping bag with someone else in it. And I won't name any names, but I went over and I sort of, gave a gentle kick and I said, that's my sleeping bag. And the person said, oh, I didn't think you were going to need it. So this is the real story from Mount Vancouver expedition. Anyway, let's move on to the main story of the night, the Great Hostel Shop Robbery. And again, this isn't the Mike Mortimer Hostel Shop; it was the one that was before that. So this story starts at this building. Does anyone here recognize this? Yeah, T Square. It was 932 Memorial Drive. It was world renowned as a climbers flop house. People would come from the States, from Europe, from England to Calgary, and they knew 2 things, come to here to go climbing in the Rockies, and they knew 2 things for certain. One was that you could go to the Empress on a Wednesday night, meet the Calgary Mountain Club. And 2, if you needed a place to stay, you could stay at T Square. And as it turned out, I was living at T Square along with Judy and John Lauchlan and Gary Jennings. And I can't remember, Judy, who else was there at that time, but Lauren Perry. But there was a long litany of people who had stayed here. But this wasn't the only flop house in Calgary, climbers flop house. There was also 2 others in Northwest Calgary. One was called Easy Street, and the other was called 2001: The Space Odyssey. And so there was these 3 places that were the kind of climber hangout. So while I was living here, I was doing sort of the standard dirtbag climber thing, climbing and working as little as possible. And one of our esteemed mountain club members, who will also, for obvious reasons, remain nameless, was actually a fairly accomplished drug dealer in town. and was trying to convince me that I should sell some marijuana in order to fund my climbing. And I kind of resisted because I wasn't really a smoker and it wasn't really my thing. But eventually I thought, yeah, maybe it might work. So I ended up buying a kilo of of, of marijuana, and it was pretty good shit. And we ended up having a what is called a key cutting party at T Square one night, and a bunch of us gathered around and we broke that kilo up into 1 ounce baggies and smoked a little bit and drank some. And what was interesting about that key cutting party was that there were some very familiar faces there, but there was one guy who I didn't know who he was, and someone else had brought him to the party. And during the party, he was saying, "Yeah, I want to get into climbing, but the gear's so expensive." He said, "Have you looked at the price? I mean, thinking about this from 2026, this is like, the cost of gear in 1978 was like irrelevant." Anyway, someone in the group said, "Well, don't worry about that. Just go rip it off." And I don't know, as sort of a junior boy choir in that period, there kind of was a culture of shoplifting, and it wasn't something I ever did, but that was the culture. And so someone had said, "Don't worry about, just go rip it off." Well, unbeknownst to us, well, certainly unbeknownst to me, after the party was over, this guy, half cut, half ripped, got in his truck and drove to the hostel shop, backed up to the back door of the hostel shop and put a chain on the door, hooked it to his back of his truck, and ripped the door off the hostel shop, and then went in and just loaded up arm after arm of duvets, ropes, climbing gear, you name it. And then he drove home. And the crazy thing about it, and I heard all this after the fact, but the crazy thing about it was that he didn't even disconnect the door from his truck. He drove home dragging the door behind his truck. Those were the days, eh? And so he pulled into his house and he fell asleep in the truck. Well, I didn't know this. I mean, of course, I wasn't part of this. I'm sound asleep. The next morning, Don Gallons, who was the manager of the hostel shop back in those days, phones me up, probably 10 o'clock in the morning. He says, "Mike, where are you?" Now, this is before cell phones. And I said, "Don, you know where I am. You just called me." He goes, "Oh, yeah. Just, can you come down to the hostel shop? I'd like to talk to you." I said, "Sure." I was thinking maybe they was going to offer me like to put me on the hostel shop professional climbing team or something. I don't know. So I know I've always been a little bit delusional. Um, so I go down to the hostel shop and I walk into the store, and a couple of the clerks were saying, "Did you hear about the robbery last night?" I said, "No, what happened?" They told me. I said, "Wow, that's pretty crazy." So I walk into Don Gowan's office, which was more like a closet, and he very quickly said, you hear about the robbery?" And I said, "Yeah, I just heard about it." And he said, "Well, we think you did it." And I was actually gobsmacked because there's no reason that I could think of why they would even suspect me. And I got angry and I said, "Don, if you think I stole it, what you should do is call the city police and report." And I stormed out of his office into the burly arms of two uh, city of Calgary police detectives, who then took me downtown and subjected me to the oh, subjected me to the hot white light treatment for probably 2 or 3 hours. Problem was I didn't know anything. I really didn't know anything. So they finally released me, and but told me not basically not to leave town. So the interesting thing about that was that this all happened just about the time. Now, Chick, I want to put you on alert here. I'm going to mention your name again, so just be ready to leap up and say it's all lies. That's not my recollection, but I'm just giving Chick fair warning. Chick was hosting a Calgary Mountain Club New Year's Eve party at his house in Banff on Cave Avenue, and I was going up to that party, and I was taking my old Malay pack with this 27 ounces of bagged marijuana, and I was going to sell it. I was going to wholesale it to another person in Banff because I didn't want to get involved in that part of the business. And so we go up there, and we're having a good party. And I'm not even thinking about the hostel shop robbery because I basically the police had let me go, I thought I was in the clear. And partway through the evening, we get a call. So the phone rings and call from Mike Sawyer. So I go over, and it turns out that the police had raided T Square, Easy Street, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and my mother's house. Now I asked my mother about who's here tonight. I asked her about this, and she denied it ever happened. But I think it's the fact she's just embarrassed about that it happened. Anyway, and so and she said, "Well, what's this all about?" And I said, "Well, it's just a misunderstanding. I'll take care of it." And I said, "Well, what did you tell the police?" And she said, "Well, I told them you're in Banff at Chick's House for a party." So I hang up the phone, and I just realized the police are coming to look for me, and I've got 27 ounces of dope in my pack. And I thought, this is not good. So, like literally, moments later, there's a knock at the door. RCMP, we're looking for Mike Sawyer. Now, I had some really good friends in the party, and my recollection was Jerry Rogan and the Burgess twins went to the back door, and they said, no, Mike Sawyer here. And while they're talking to the cops, I'm going out Chick's bathroom window into the snow, which in those days was quite deep, and I up into the forest behind his house, and I hung that pack on a pine branch and never went back. So when I talked earlier on about my very short career as a drug dealer, that was the extent of my career. But it's arguable that I actually never was a drug dealer because I never sold any drugs. 100%. It was a bad investment. I spent the money on the drugs and then left them in a tree. Probably found by some happy elk at some point. Anyway, after that, got back to Calgary, turned myself in. I did get arrested, and they had a countrywide warrant out for arrest, and I was let go on promise to appear in court. And in the meantime, we had the scuttlebutt in the climbing community. We had heard who actually had done the crime, and so I phoned the person up and I said, there's no way I'm going to take a rap for something I had nothing to do with. And I said, sooner or later it's going to come out you did the crime, and the best thing you could do is hire a criminal defense lawyer and then turn yourself in, which he did do. And I don't know if any of you know this character. I'm not going to name his name, but he's a regular in the Canmore, Banff area. This is the dude who actually did the crime. And he got a relatively light sentence from that event, and it all worked out in the end. Does anyone know this guy? Yeah, you know, and he's, I like him. Like Crazy Larry's his name, but he is truly one of the Rocky Mountain characters. He's a modern day Rocky Mountain character. So I just wanted to thank, first of all, a few people who gave me the use of their imagery. So Trevor Jones, Pat Morrow, Judy Sterner, Dan Griffith, Gary Jennings, and others. And that's the end of my story. So I'm happy to answer any questions, or I mean I'm happy to defend myself in the face of accusations of utter lies. So anyway, that's it. Does anyone like to ask a question? Say again? Yes. Yeah, me too. Okay. Well, it's interesting. It's actually a very good question. About 4 years ago, I was thinking about this, and I thought, I wonder if it's still there. And so I went down on Cave Avenue, and I sort of tried to figure out where Chick's house used to be, because it's all been redeveloped now. And I thought, okay, it was here. And I went up into the forest. But the problem is, in the ensuing 45 years, they redeveloped I think they call it Valley View up there, that subdivision. And so when I walked up into the forest, the place where I would have hung it has been totally cleared now and is a subdivision. And so maybe it was an elk that found it, maybe it was a hapless construction worker, I don't know, but it's gone. So no, you can't go find it. Okay, thanks for coming. No, but I'm.
I think I better put this thing on this time. Mike, on behalf of the Calgary Mountain Club, here's your poster. Want to thank you for coming in and doing the show. It was great to hear about the drinking. Really enjoyed that. The vomiting was beautiful. Could be a painting technique, a new painting technique. It would probably be like a tie-dye thing or something. I don't know. Anyway, Mike. Yeah. Oh yeah, we are going to pass the pass the hat kind of thing around. Mike, I'm glad you came. We finally got a show out of you. It was that was a lot of fun. Thank you. Can we thank Mike one more time, please? Thanks to Ken Weens for keeping the club alive, for doing all the organizing, all the emailing, all that stuff Ken does. Thank you so much. And to Keith for being the 10-year president. Highly appreciated.